Let's face it, every customer is different. Some like walnut furniture and some like painted, and these customers are somewhere in between. But sometimes I wonder if customers even know the lengths we have to go through for their fine furniture. Every project begins with a quick recap since I likely did the drawings and the proposal weeks before, and referencing my notes and 3D model, I can begin a game plan. This cabinet is going to be a bit fancier than what you typically see on YouTube. The 8-inch tall base will add visual weight for the fluted columns on either side that are capped with a bed molding. The inset doors will have gold grills, and the face frame will have a decorative rabbit to add extra line work. All of this will be finished off with a walnut top since they already have a lot of walnut in the room. I've spent a lot of time building different cabinet boxes out of different materials at different times of my life, and slowly but surely I've kind of curated a process to help build more efficiently and still have a lot of strength. So some of this might be a little confusing at first, but just know that it really doesn't matter. You don't have to use dados, and you certainly don't have to use pocket screws either. In fact, I have a video where I built my miter saw station, and I literally just glued and brad nailed all the cabinets together, and they are just fine. So if you want a stupid simple way of building cabinets, I would probably reference that video after you finish this one. As for right now, I'm just finishing cutting all of the rough parts that I need for the cabinet box. I like to make sure that the rip width is correct on every piece before I move forward to cross-cutting. I've been considering a lot lately whether I made the right choice when I invested in my saw. Because let's be honest, there are some amazing panel saws out there that can handle some big sheets. But I think having a saw that can detect skin is far more valuable than having a dedicated slider, because as you'll see later in the video, the detection mechanism works, and it works fast. I'm having Cody drill some pocket holes because we like to use pocket screws and dados together. And I've said in the past that the dados are for strength, but I'm really beginning to realize that it's actually more for convenience. They really just offer a perfect way to position each piece exactly the same every time. And as long as the position of the dado is correct, then I know the position of the final piece will also be correct. But nonetheless, the only things that need to actually be dadoed are the back and the base, which is a relatively quick process since it's only one cabinet. Just make sure the sides are mirror images. Now that I can reference that dado, I can measure and cut the center panel that will be the divider. A good way to make sure if this is correct is by setting it against the dados on one of the side panels and seeing if it's proud anywhere. And since my front side is a bit proud, I can just nip it on the table saw, which sounds pretty painful now that I think about it. Anyways, like I just said, the positioning of this piece is perfect because I already know the placement of the dado. The top stretchers are not dadoed in though, they're just pocket screwed. And the forward-facing stretcher as well as the base are set 3/16 back. This makes it so that the only pieces in the face frame that I have to dado are just the stiles, no rails. I've learned to take that out of the equation because dadoing the rails costs a lot of time and doesn't have a whole lot of benefit, while having dados in the vertical stiles helps the alignment of the frame when we install it. Another cool trick is setting the center panel on one of the sides. It doesn't matter if it's horizontal. Then I can measure the remaining width and physically bend that measurement in half to find half of the original measurement. By cutting a piece to that length, I can use it as a stop to find the exact position of the center panel. Which is kind of silly considering I just told you that I use dados to find the positions of certain pieces. So why in the heck didn't I use a dado here? And the real answer is my OCD is an animal of its own, and the logical part of me doesn't always win. The truth of the matter is that I don't have everything planned out before the project begins. Only after I build everything and edit this video am I able to explain what I do and why. Even the detailed 3D model isn't even done until I start the video. I just start with a basic 3D model to show the customer. So rather than getting stuck on specific details, I think it's more important to just keep moving and find solutions. Or at least that's what I tell myself to make myself feel better. The back panel will be fully installed after finishing. Now that the cabinet box is done, we can start the detailed face frame, and these decorative rabbits will be easier said than done. The normal thickness of maple that we would start with is 4/4 or 25mm, but this face frame needs to be 15/16 or 23mm thick to account for that rabbit, so this stock is 5/4 stock. Sometimes doing even the simplest of things can present problems.
Hold on.
Instead of having Cody risk injury by forcing this board through the saw, it's much safer to just use a shim to open up that kerf and relieve some of that binding. And while he finishes milling, I'm proud to tell you that the Fortress shop is now open just in time for the new year. So pick yourself up an In Wood We Trust hoodie in a range of different colors, and any gold mugs are on sale at 20% off for a limited time. You'll also find access to join my Patreon, and now is a better time than ever because my patrons get 20% off their entire order until the end of January. Just go to unlockfortress.com or click the link below. Now that the maple has been thicknessed to 15/16 and brought to the correct different widths, we can begin cutting them to the correct lengths and start making the face frame. If you don't have a stop block, you can cut them in pairs to ensure that they're the same lengths. So now the center style can be marked out and positioned, followed by the wider side styles. These are extra wide than normal because they're going to be covered with the fluted pillars. And this small little trick is really helpful at figuring out where to place the dominoes and exactly where those centers should be, since our human eyes are actually really good at finding centers of small things like this. Or again, that's at least what I tell myself to make myself feel better. Now I can run a test rabbit in a piece of plywood to see how it fits with the cabinet. And this may come across as confusing considering I called it a dado earlier. But only this center style gets a dado because it's centered with the mid panel, but the sides need a rabbit because they need to be flush with the sides of the cabinet, mainly because the fluted pillars will need a nice corner to attach to. So easy enough, I can have Cody mortise all of the holes for the dominoes. Or at least usually it's easy enough, and this time it went really well, but there are some times where there's a lot of cabinets to do, and you can get some weird inconsistencies of how flush the two pieces mate together. And I've paid very close attention to see if sometimes we don't have the base plate of the domino all the way down on the piece when we're cutting, but usually it is, so I don't know what's actually causing that error when it happens. And I have paid very close attention to see if there are times where we haven't had the base plate of the domino all the way down on the workpiece when we've been cutting. So I don't quite know what's causing that issue when it does happen. Now that everything is cleanly joined together, we can sand the whole thing flat before we add the decorative rabbit on the inside edge. For this next operation, I strongly recommend that you have an extremely sharp bit. And I even suggest using a marking gauge to pre-cut the fibers, because I tried doing this method before using a lesser quality bit and I still got tons of tear out. So knowing that I needed really sharp bits for this project, I reached out to my friends at Bits and Bits. And I can tell you from literal first-hand experience that I didn't get a single fiber of tear out on this entire cut. And knowing that the Astra coating will prolong the life of the bit, I know that it'll keep cutting this nicely for a very long time. So even though these bits were supplied to me at no cost, I definitely will be purchasing them as I need them in the future. And I will leave links to all of the ones that I use in this video below. Since the router leaves rounded corners, we need to carefully square those off while also keeping them very neat since they are decorative. I'm doing a rough cut first, then finalizing with the edge cut at the end. This makes it easier for the chisel to cut cleanly since the waste has already been removed. And the neater this is, the more impressive it will be. At first, I always go really slow so that I don't screw any cuts up, but as I progress, I tend to get a little bit faster while keeping the same quality. And even if you're not that good at chiseling, you can spend more time sanding in the end and it'll still look great. Now that we won't be doing any further cuts on this piece, we can do a final sanding and get everything prepped. Breaking all of the sharp edges will help the paint adhere to those fine corners. And I'm making sure I don't forget about the outside edge of the rabbit. There's just one more important step before we mount it to the box. The inset doors are pretty darn cool, but they require special clips that are much easier installed before the frame is on rather than after. Mainly because they take robust screws that are really hard to screw in if you happen to be reaching inside of a cabinet. And these are stainless steel screws because I have broken way too many of the zinc coated ones, and installing them laying down is much easier. While Cody is milling some maple for the door frames, I can work on getting the face frame mounted with pocket screws. The screws are perfect because they're temporary. We can put the frame on now, but also take it apart so that we can spray it later. And I always seem to forget that there are a few little spots on the cabinet that need to be cut away so that the frame can seat all of the way down. And with those little sections out of the way, everything fits like a glove. And like I mentioned before, those rabbits and dados keep everything aligned so it's really easy to screw on with accuracy. This front hollow section will create problems for the baseboard though. So the best solution is to install a piece of plywood since it won't cause expansion and contraction issues, but it will offer a place for the baseboard to mount to later. I keep my bottom frames a 32nd proud of the plywood. The next components to build are the panel-less doors since the panels will eventually be metal grills. And the maple is milled to the same thickness as the remaining face frame. These are very special rail and style bits, and that's another reason I reached out to Bits and Bits, because we actually need to take off the top cutter of the tenoning bit, but we're leaving the bearing on. A normal rail tenon looks like this, but we actually want this. And this will all make more sense in a minute, but for now let's cut all of the rail ends. And cutting them before we do the grooves ensures that we don't get weird tear out on the groove side. So now that all of those unique rails are cut, we can switch over to the grooving bit, but the cool part is we can use the cutter that we took off the other bit and use it on this one. The bearing will now be too high to reference the board, but I'm still putting it on so that I can set the fence properly. By switching the cutters on these bits, it will now make it a rabbit rather than a groove, but the rail will still mate nicely with this style. And this happens to be extremely convenient because a groove wouldn't allow us to mount the metal grill later, while a rabbit will. And the last step I always do is adding that shadow line on the front edge with the 60-degree V-groove bit. But the stiles need a stop cut because we don't want to screw up those mating ends. Oh, it's gluing time once again, and for a while I was thinking whether these joints were going to be strong enough because the tenon is no longer a tenon and there's a little bit less surface area than usual. But I remembered an old factory trick that will solve that issue. So after everything is clamped and cleaned up, I'm adding an extra clamp to each joint, then running about 4 or 5 pin nails through the joint to create a mechanical advantage. This essentially creates a pinned joint. And in the odd event that there's a glue failure, the pins will keep the joint together for the rest of its life. What you don't see behind the scenes is that Cody and I work together a lot more than you'd think. We just have to film it, so usually one of us is out of view. And it did take us a while to find our groove, but then again, when does it not? So I guess I'm thankful. The drum sander no doubt creates a perfectly flat surface, but if you spend your time doing the joints properly, then it should be flat enough to just sand with an orbital. and making the doors oversized so that you can square them up and cut them to actual size afterwards will save you a lot of trouble, especially with inset doors. And the final tailoring steps are as usual: a 150 grit sanding on the face sides, a 150 grit sanding on the edges, whichever way floats your boat, a 1/8 roundover on the face side, and once again easing any sharp edges. The Blum hinges that work with the clips that I mounted to the face frame are the half overlay clip-on hinges. The offset for the hinge cup that's mortised into the door is a little bit different than usual, so just do your own testing beforehand. And the doors would look like poo-poo if they were kinked in like this, so we need to make some small door stops. Another option besides making your own doorstops is using the magnetic catches that they have. There are many different types and models, and some are even adjustable and pretty fancy. But in this case, I think just some simple doorstops will do just fine. Just don't be a silly guy like me and try to put these things in without pre-drilling. Sometimes I still get lazy from time to time, and luckily it's on stupid little things, but nonetheless. I'm mounting the top block to the frame rather than the plywood. And now these things are perfectly flush, like it was planned. Moving on to the fluted columns. And of course, I made it a little complicated. The front side is 1 inch thick, but the side is only 13/16 thick. This will ensure that the sides line up with the walls when it's installed. But if it were you doing it, I'm sure you would probably take the time to make sure everything's the same measurement so it's not so complicated. With the saw set to a perfect 45, I can cut the miters down one side of each board. A very important thing to take note of though is that we can't use brad nails or pin nails down that joint. I'm using one single pin to tack the joint, then the rest will be held with miter spring clamps. And if you haven't already figured it out, we can't use pin nails all the way down because then when we cut our flutes, we would be cutting pin nail after pin nail after pin nail. And that does not sound like a fun time. So after about 2 hours of dry time, we can pull the miter spring clamps and begin touching up the corners. By far the most effective method for this is filling any gaps with glue, then burnishing it with a really hard screwdriver. This actually closes any gaps really tightly and the glue holds everything together. Some filler fills the pricks from the miter spring clamps and we're off to the races. This next bit is a beauty of a bit and it really has a simple job. It's only cutting about a 1/4 inch deep, but that cut also needs to be beautiful. And I also want the flutes to stop near the top of the doors and near the bottom of the doors. So marking those on each piece ensures that I don't pass those marks. And laying out the locations of the flutes is also helpful. I'm setting the fence to the first correct distance and also marking lines on the fence where I can start and stop my cuts. I'm making sure to orient the top of the column forward always. This will just grant less possibility that I also screw that up. Otherwise, the cut is pretty simple. It starts with a plunge cut, then I cut all the way down until the back meets the line, then I can pull up. But here's where another problem can occur. Make sure the fence stays in the same relative position to the edge of the table. Otherwise, you could accidentally move your reference lines forward or back. And of course, also make sure that your columns are a mirror image. And now that the fluting is done, I'm a little impatient and I want to see how it looks. But the fun isn't over. We still have to make sure we sand the faces and sand any inconsistencies out of the flutes. But this wouldn't be a YouTube video without at least a little bit of walnut. And I'll be honest, I hear it all the time. This wood tends to be most people's favorite wood, and it actually is one of my favorites as well. So I guess I can't blame everyone, but let's see what it has to do with this project. The walnut top will eventually get cut to fit in the alcove that it's going in, but to keep things simple, we're just going to keep it full for this video. I'm not going to be doing the install since the final shots will be in my office where a lot better light cascades in. I'm not just milling these boards willy-nilly, because mainly I want to be able to see how the boards fit together and how they look. Then I can choose what faces to mill off, considering the joiner only takes off about a 1/16 to an 1/8, while the planer will take off closer to 3/16. For example, if I want a lot of the sapwood to be taken off, I know that most of it will be taken off in the planer rather than on the joiner. I know that's more complicated than it probably needs to be, but when you're a professional and you're working with woods like walnut, you always have to think about grain orientation and sapwood. With great tight-fitting joints, you shouldn't need very much clamping pressure at all, and you shouldn't even need to use dark wood glue because essentially the joint will be invisible anyways. So I guess maybe a silly rule in the shop should be always use ugly yellow glue. That way you actually make sure your joints are perfect. But then again, I also understand that not everyone has a joiner, so pick your poison. The glue is easily scraped off about 3 or 4 hours later. Then we can send this whole thing through the planer. The small maple boards will just absorb any planer snipe if there is any. While I go to the home center to get a few pieces of trim that we need, Cody can begin sanding both sides with 80 grit, then 150. Before cross-cutting it to length, it's easy to add a little blue tape. This will ensure that there's no tear out where the blade exits. But this is only necessary where the blade will exit on the front show side. Now it's as simple as sanding all the edges and adding a round over to the top side with a 1/4 inch round over bit that isn't at full depth. This just makes it look more like a bevel. Okay, now we have mostly everything done, but there's a few extras that we need to take care of first. The adjustable shelving is pretty easy. It's just plywood panels cut with front edge banding added. We're using real wood edge banding, that way the primer adheres properly. But if all you have is melamine edge banding, you could probably get away with it if you sand it with 150 grit first. And this pre-finished plywood needs a scuff sand, that way the finish also adheres. The next small detail is the quarter round that will hold the metal grills into the doors. And as funny as this sounds, these little darn things gave me a run for my money. You can take notice that this cut goes extremely well, no problem, and so does this cut, but this cut is what gives me problems. I should nickname that piece of trim Britney Spears.
Glad that wasn't my body.
But I'm only slightly stupid because I quickly learned that I can use another push block to guide the cut. And now you can see where that quarter round will go. But boy, is that incident still on my mind. I mean, I'm lucky that Cody wasn't standing behind me because he very well could have gotten speared that day. And either it could have hit him in the meaty part of his butt and we would have had a good laugh, or it could have hit him in a soft part of his eyeball and we would have had a different story. So I'm thankful the dust collection hose showed the gravity of the situation, and I'm even more thankful that Cody has both of his eyeballs. And while we're on the harmonic note of gratitude, thank you to my Patreon members. My patrons really are a community of people that just want to support this channel, and I appreciate you. The walnut needs to be finished with a solvent top coat. It's mainly to match the walnut that's already in the house. You can use a water base, but the color will kind of come out light and grayish. A quick flattening with 320 grit will make sure everything is flat as glass before we spray the top coat. And boy, does that look good. Then the primer can get sprayed with insane mechanical precision. Or just by me and Cody. The primer is actually the easy part because you can just sand out any runs or drips. We use 320 grit for lighter colors like white, and we use 400 grit for darker colors that can show the scratches more through the top coat. If you sanded your primer to perfection, then when you spray your top coat on, it lays out beautifully, and when it dries, that satin finish is perfect. To fill those pesky little holes that the hangers create, we just use white wax, and it fills it well enough that you can barely even see it. With 24 hours cure time, we can begin putting the cabinet together. If you try to assemble it the same day, you might risk scratching it pretty easily. And I'm gluing on this face frame, but I don't have those door clips installed, and trust me, it was a bugger trying to install them later. We haven't talked much about the trim. There's a main baseboard, a base cap, and a base shoe. Then at the top we have something called a bed molding. All of these items have been pre-finished, and the base has to be cut on a table saw since it's too tall for a miter saw. And I'm getting the best joints I can, but everything's just tacked in place for final shots since it will actually be installed at the residence. The smaller moldings were much easier to cut at the miter saw. And individually they look pretty boring, but when you put them together, it looks pretty fancy. The top will just be screwed from the underside during install. The last shenanigan we got ourselves into, or I guess I got us into, is cutting the anodized aluminum grills. And this is where I screw up.
Oh no!
Yep, I forgot to turn the saw back on bypass mode when I turned it back on. And aluminum unfortunately triggers the mechanism. So there goes one of my favorite blades and one of the brake cartridges. Instead of using the saw stop, I should have just used this little DeWalt saw just like I did in the last series when we were cutting brass. And I have to bypass the safety mechanism on the saw stop anyways, so I wouldn't have that protection. But long story short, the metal grills are cut to size, and the mistake I made cost more than the metal grills cost. So after beating myself up incessantly through this project, one thing comes to mind. Money is money, and it doesn't really matter, but I can't buy Cody another pair of eyeballs. Please subscribe by clicking the left icon, check out all of our awesome build videos, and here's another unique video to watch.